She placed the last $50 she had in the world on the offering plate and went home to 3 eggs and a heel of bread. That was a Sunday. By the following Thursday, everything that had been taken from her was coming back. The universe does not keep score, but people do. And 2 years after she lost everything, a man knocked on Eudora Mevis Holt's door and handed her an envelope. She did not know him. She did not know what was inside. But by the time she finished reading it, nothing would ever be the same again. The woman he handed them to was Eudora Mevis Holt. And Eudora had spent 40 years writing down the names of people who needed her. One of those names was about to find its way back. The church was full that Sunday morning. October in Savannah, the air outside sharp enough to make people move faster toward warmth and music and something larger than themselves. Eudora sat in the 4th pew from the front. Same seat for 31 years. She had her coat on her lap and her purse on the floor beside her feet and her hands folded in her lap. Her mother had taught her that before her mother was gone, and everything her mother taught her was all she had left of her. The pastor finished his announcements and then paused for a bit. The kind of silence that told the congregation something difficult was coming. He said there was a young woman in their community, 24 years old, a seamstress. She had a nerve condition in her left hand that had been deteriorating for 8 months. Without surgery, she would lose permanent use of it. The community medical fund had been working. They were $50 short. Time had run out. The surgery was scheduled for Tuesday. Eudora looked down at her hands. She thought about 40 years of using her hands to hold the hands of people who were suffering. She thought about what it meant to lose the use of one. She thought about a young woman whose whole livelihood lived in her fingers. She opened her purse. Inside was $50. The last of it until her Social Security check arrived in 11 days. She had been managing on what was in her refrigerator: 3 eggs, half a carton of milk, a heel of bread, and telling herself 11 days was nothing. She had waited longer for harder things. She took the $50 out. She held it for a moment. $50. 11 days until the next check. 3 eggs in the refrigerator and a heel of bread and half a carton of milk that was going to run out before the week did. She had lived through harder calculations than this. She had lived through Gerald and through Elroy and through a robbery that took everything she had saved across 40 years. She had moved through every one of those things because moving was what she knew how to do. She walked to the front. She placed it on the offering plate. The fund coordinator looked at it. She knew Eudora. She knew what had happened to Eudora 2 years ago. She reached for it to hand it back. Eudora closed the coordinator's fingers around the bill. "It is not much," she said, "but it is what I have today." She walked back to her pew. She picked up her coat. She went home. She opened her refrigerator. 3 eggs, half a carton of milk, a heel of bread. She made herself dinner. She did not think about the $50 again. She did not give it to be found. She did not give it expecting anything back. She gave it because a young woman was going to lose her hand, and Eudora had spent 40 years understanding what that cost, and $50 was what she had. Some decisions are simply that straightforward. She did not know that the young woman's grandmother had been looking for her for 31 years. She did not know that the name on the offering envelope, Eudora Holt, was about to travel 3 blocks, change hands twice, and find its way to a woman who had been carrying something that belonged to Eudora since 1995. She just went home and made dinner. 2 years before that Sunday, Eudora had $190,000. Not a fortune. The accumulation of 40 years of careful living. A floor nurse's salary stretched and saved and protected across 4 decades because Eudora understood early that the only safety net she was ever going to have was the one she built herself. She owned her house outright. A small 2-bedroom on Gaston Street in Savannah that she had paid off in 1998 and kept the deed in a shoebox under her bed. She had her pension. She had her savings. She had the Social Security check that arrived on the 2nd Wednesday of every month without fail. She had a small emergency fund in a separate account that she had never touched and never planned to. $10,000 set aside for trouble that does not announce itself before it arrives. She had enough. For the first time in her adult life, she had enough. It had taken a long time to get there. She had married young. A man named Gerald who was charming before he was cruel. She left. She went back to nursing school, built a career with her own hands, and asked nobody for help. She had one child from that marriage, a son named Elroy, sickle cell disease. She managed his care for 26 years with the knowledge of a nurse and the love of a mother. He died at 32. She buried him on a Tuesday. She went back to work on Thursday. Sitting inside the destruction felt more dangerous than moving through it. So she moved. She had always moved. That was the only thing she knew how to do with loss. Move through it until it became part of her instead of something on top of her. By the time she retired, she had cared for thousands of patients. She kept handwritten cards on everyone. Name what they feared, what helped, whether family was coming. Thousands of cards in a shoebox in her closet. 40 years of people she had stayed with. She had enough. Then the phone calls started. A calm professional voice that knew her name, her bank, enough details to sound like someone who was supposed to know those things. She asked questions. He had answers. She transferred $40,000. 3 weeks later, better returns, statements she could see with her own eyes. She transferred $80,000. 2 weeks after that, she transferred $60,000. Then the statements stopped arriving. By the time she understood what was happening, $180,000 was gone. In 8 weeks, through a series of wire transfers that her bank flagged too late and her local police detective received too politely to pursue. These cases were hard to trace. These people were hard to find. She should be careful going forward. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table. She thought about 40 years of careful living reduced to a police report number and a detective's sympathetic shrug. Then she got up and made dinner because she was hungry, and the world had not stopped turning just because she had been robbed. What she did not know yet, what she would not know for another 2 years, was that the person who handed her name to the syndicate lived 3 houses down. Cashin Dwight was 31 years old and had grown up eating at Eudora's table. His mother Hattie had been Eudora's neighbor for 22 years. When Cashin was born 6 weeks premature and spent his first 2 weeks in an incubator at Savannah Memorial, it was Eudora who sat with Hattie in the waiting room through the nights when the fear was loudest. When Cashin was 7 and broke his arm falling from a tree, it was Eudora who drove them to the emergency room because Hattie did not drive. When Cashin graduated high school, it was Eudora who baked the cake. Cashin moved to Atlanta at 24, came back to Savannah occasionally, brought gifts, called his mother, presented well, smiled at the right times. What Hattie did not know was that Cashin had been part of an elder financial fraud syndicate for 4 years. They moved across Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida targeting elderly women living alone. They used phone calls. They used email. They used in-person visits that looked like routine insurance or investment follow-ups. They had processed dozens of victims before they found Eudora. Cashin was not the caller. He was the identifier. He gave them the name, the address, the financial profile. He had been in Eudora's house. He had seen the shoebox under her bed. He knew what she had and where she kept it. He did not steal from a stranger. He stole from the woman who helped raise him. He handed it to them and collected his percentage and did not think about it after that. The surgery happened on Tuesday. Tamsin Odessa Crane was 24 years old. A seamstress. She made her living with her hands. Alterations, custom pieces, repair work for people all across Savannah who had learned that Tamsin's work lasted and her prices were fair. Her left hand was her dominant hand. Without it, she had nothing. The fund coordinator pieced together the final $50 from the Sunday offering. Tamsin went into surgery. She came out with full use of her hand restored. The coordinator called Tamsin the following week to confirm the surgery had gone well. She mentioned that the last donation, the one that closed the gap, had come from a woman named Eudora Holt. She said it because she thought Tamsin should know someone had given their last to make it happen. Tamsin never forgot that name. She never knew who gave the last $50 directly, but her grandmother knew what that name meant. Adeline Faye Dupert was 79 years old and had been looking for a nurse named Eudora for 31 years. In 1995, Adeline was a patient at Savannah Memorial Hospital. 48 years old. 3 days post-surgery. Her marriage had ended. Her children were young and far away. Not one person was coming. She lay in that bed at night and felt the terror of complete loneliness. Not the absence of company but the absence of anyone who claimed her. A floor nurse sat with her every night that week after her shift ended. She brought food from the cafeteria. She talked. She held Adeline's hand when the pain was bad and did not make it feel like a burden to need that. On the last night before Adeline was discharged, the nurse handed her a small handwritten card. Adeline's name, what she had been afraid of, what had helped, and at the bottom in careful handwriting, * no family came, but you were not alone. Adeline kept that card for 31 years. She looked for the nurse whose first name she remembered. She lost the trail when Eudora retired and moved to a different part of the city. She never stopped looking. When Tamsin came home from the hospital and told her grandmother that a woman named Eudora Holt had given the last $50 that funded her surgery, Adeline went completely still. She asked Tamsin to say the name again. Then she asked for an address. Adeline arrived at Eudora's house on a Wednesday afternoon. She knocked twice, waited, knocked again. When Eudora opened the door, she saw a woman she did not recognize. 79 years old, small, upright, holding her purse in front of her with both hands, clutching it tightly, like something she had been carrying for a long time and was finally about to put down. Eudora did not recognize the face. 31 years changes a face completely. But something in the woman's posture made Eudora hold the door open instead of asking who she was. Adeline did not say anything at first. She reached into her purse slowly. She took out a small card. The edges were soft from years of handling. The paper had gone slightly yellow at the corners. She held it up. Eudora looked at it from the doorway. She looked at the handwriting. Her own. From 31 years ago. Written on a Tuesday night at the end of a 12-hour shift in a hospital ward on the south side of Savannah. She stepped forward and took the card. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at the woman standing on her porch. She did not remember the face. But she remembered what she had written. She remembered the fear underneath those words. Not her own fear, someone else's. The fear of a woman alone in a hospital bed at night who needed someone to stay and did not know how to ask. Eudora had stayed. "I remember you," she said. "I know. I never stopped looking for you." They stood in the doorway of Eudora's small house on Gaston Street for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the oak trees at the end of the street. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking. The world was completely ordinary around them. Then Eudora opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. Adeline knew Sandrine Marsh from church. Sandrine was 46 years old. A consumer fraud attorney in Savannah who specialized in elder financial abuse. She had been building a case against a fraud syndicate operating across 3 states for 8 months. Other victims had already reported the syndicate to federal investigators. Enough reports to open a case, not enough documentation to prosecute. She had victims. She had financial records. She needed one more cooperating witness whose documentation was clean enough and detailed enough to anchor the prosecution. That evening Adeline called her. Sandrine met Eudora on Thursday morning. She took the case pro bono before she left the house. It was strategically useful. Eudora's documentation was exactly what the federal case needed. But that was not the reason. Adeline Dupert had told Sandrine the story of a floor nurse who sat with her in 1995 every year of Sandrine's life. 31 years of that story, and now she finally had somewhere to put it. Eudora's documentation was meticulous. 40 years of nursing had taught her that documentation saves lives. She had kept every communication, every receipt, every bank statement, every email since the call started. She had a file folder that a federal prosecutor could read in an afternoon. Sandrine read it in 40 minutes. She set the folder down. She sat back in her chair. Then she looked up. "I know who did this to you." Eudora looked at her. "The man who gave them your name," Sandrine said. "We have been watching his syndicate for 8 months. We have been missing the identifier, the person on the inside who profiles the targets. Your documentation puts him there." Eudora sat with that for a moment. "Who is it?" she asked. Sandrine told her. Eudora sat frozen in shock for a while. She thought about a 7-year-old boy with his arm in a cast in her car driving to the emergency room. She thought about a graduation cake she baked on a Saturday morning. She thought about Hattie calling her from the hospital when Cashin was born premature, and the two of them sitting in the waiting room through the night because that was what neighbors did. She thought about her shoebox under the bed, and a man who had been in her house and had seen it and had handed that information to people who knew exactly what to do with it. She thought about how long it takes to build $190,000 on a floor nurse's salary. Does his mother know about this? No, Sandrine said. Eudora looked out the window toward the street. Toward 3 houses down where Hattie's front light was already on in the early evening dark. Tell me what we do next. Cashin Dwight Foley was arrested on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks later. 4 other syndicate members were arrested the same day across 2 states. Federal charges, wire fraud, elder financial abuse, a pattern of criminal activity spanning 4 years and dozens of victims documented across 3 states. Cashin's name and photograph appeared on the local evening news. Hattie Louise Foley watched it from her living room 3 houses down from Eudora. She sat in her chair deep in thoughts after the broadcast ended. The room was dark. She had not moved to turn a light on. She just sat in the dark with what she now knew about her son and what he had done to the woman 3 houses down who had been nothing but good to both of them. Then she put on her coat. She walked 3 houses down. She knocked on Eudora's door. When Eudora opened it, Hattie could not speak. She had been crying since the broadcast ended. Her eyes were swollen and her hands were shaking, and she was standing on Eudora's porch at 8 o'clock at night with nothing prepared to say because there were no words for what her son had done to the woman who had helped raise him. 22 years. 22 years of this street and this neighbor. Soup when Hattie was sick. Drives to the emergency room. Birthday cakes. A woman who had shown up for Cashin more consistently than half the people who shared his blood. And Cashin had looked at that woman and calculated her and handed her to people whose job was to take everything she had. Hattie had not known. She had lived 3 houses away for 22 years, and her son had been doing this and she had not known. That was its own kind of weight to carry, and she was carrying it alone on a porch at 8 o'clock at night because she did not know where else to go. Hattie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Eudora looked at her standing there in the dark. She looked at this woman she had known for 22 years. Not Cashin, not what Cashin did, but Hattie herself, who had known nothing and was standing here now because she did not know where else to go with what she was carrying. A lot of people would have closed that door. Eudora opened it wider. She put the kettle on. They sat together at Eudora's kitchen table in silence. She made Hattie tea. She just made the tea and set it down and let Hattie sit in a place that was warm until she was ready to go back out into the cold. That was all. The prosecutor came to Sandrine 3 weeks after the arrest. Cashin wanted to cooperate. Full disclosure. Syndicate structure. Count information. The location of recovered assets across 3 states. In exchange, a reduced sentence. 3 years instead of 14. Sandrine brought it to Eudora. Eudora sat with it for 2 days. She thought about 14 years. She thought about Cashin at 7 years old with his arm in a cast, in her car, driving to the emergency room on a Saturday morning because Hattie did not drive and she was the neighbor who showed up. She thought about the graduation cake she baked and Cashin standing at the door thanking her like he meant it. Like he was a person who understood what showing up cost. She thought about the percentage he collected, and what he did with it while she was sitting at her kitchen table trying to understand how $180,000 disappears in 8 weeks. She thought about the money sitting buried in accounts while lawyers argued. She thought about being 74 years old and how many years she had left to wait. On the second day she called Sandrine. Yes to the deal, she said. Not forgiveness. Not mercy. A decision made by a woman who had been waiting long enough for things that belonged to her and was done waiting. Cashin got 3 years. The asset recovery took 4 months. Not everything came back. Some of it was gone beyond tracing. But enough. A number that, when Sandrine said it out loud on a Thursday afternoon, made Eudora go completely quiet at her kitchen table. Eudora asked her to say it again. Sandrine said it again. Eudora looked at her hands. These hands that had held thousands of patients through 40 years. These hands that had signed closing documents she trusted without reading. These hands that had placed $50 on an offering plate on a Sunday morning when they had nothing left to give and nobody watching and no reason to expect anything back. She did not weep. She just sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Quiet. Hands folded. The weight that had been sitting on her chest for 2 years was gone. Then she got up and made dinner. The same table. The same kitchen. The same small house on Gaston Street. But the ground was solid under her feet again. That evening Eudora went to her closet. She found the shoebox of patient cards. She worked through the years carefully. 2001, 1999, 1997, 1995. She found Adeline's card near the back of the 1995 stack. She held it under the lamp and read her own handwriting from 31 years ago. The name, what Adeline had been afraid of, what had helped, and the last line, no family came. But you were not alone. She read it twice. She thought about the night she wrote it. A Tuesday, end of a 12-hour shift. She had been on her feet since 7 in the morning, and she had stayed an extra hour in that ward because Adeline's light was on and her eyes were open, and she looked like a woman who needed someone to stay. Eudora had stayed. She had not thought about it in 31 years. She did not think about those nights. You stayed because you stayed. You wrote the card because it was the right thing to do. You moved on to the next patient and the next shift, and you did not keep score because keeping score was not the point. The point was the staying. That was always the only point. She found an envelope. She wrote Adeline's address on the front. She put the card inside. She found a small piece of paper and wrote one line and folded it in with the card. You found me. Now keep it. Then she sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her and looked at the small house on Gaston Street that she had paid off in 1998 and kept through everything. The marriage, the grief, the years of careful living, the slow theft, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 2 years. She had always been the person who showed up for everyone else. She had never once asked anyone to show up for her. She had not known how to ask. She had not needed to. She had built a life out of showing up and trusted that the life itself was enough. The world had shown up anyway. She had spent 40 years writing down the names of people who needed her. One of those names had a granddaughter whose surgery needed $50 and a grandmother who had been carrying a card for 31 years waiting to find the woman who wrote it. That chain had nothing to do with reward, and everything to do with what a life of showing up leaves behind in the world long after the person who built it stops keeping count. The following Tuesday Eudora was back at the community center. Same chair, same time, same coat on the same hook by the door. 6 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nothing had changed and everything had. The coordinator saw her come in and started to say something about the $50, the recovery, cash-in, all of it. Eudora hung her coat on the hook. She picked up the intake folder. "Who is first?" she said. Cash-in Dwight Foley accepted a deal that gave him 3 years. Some people say that is justice. Others say 3 years for what he did to a 74-year-old woman who baked his graduation cake is not justice. It is arithmetic. And the arithmetic does not balance. And then there is Hattie, who sat at Eudora's kitchen table and drank the tea Eudora made for her. A lot of people would have closed that door. Eudora did not close it. You decide what that means. If you know someone who kept showing up quietly for everyone while the world was taking from them, send them this tonight. They need to know you see it. Subscribe to Storytelling Empire. See you in the next story. Thank you for watching.